Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Beginning of Things by Abby Farwell Brown. The oldest stories of every race of people tell about the beginning of things. But the various folk who first told them were so very different, the tales are so very old, and have changed so greatly in the telling from one generation to another, that there are almost as many accounts of the way in which the world began as there are nations upon the earth. So it is not strange that the people of the north have a legend of the beginning quite different from that of the southern, eastern, and western folk. This book is made of the stories told by the northern folk, the people who live in the land of the midnight sun, where summer is green and pleasant, but winter is a terrible time of cold and gloom, where rocky mountains tower like huge giants, over whose heads the thunder rolls and crashes, and under whose feet are mines of precious metals. Therefore you will find the tales full of giants and dwarfs, spirits of the cold mountains and dark caverns. You will find the hero to be Thor, with his thunderbolt hammer, who dwells in the happy heaven of Asgard, where All-Father Odin is king, and where Balder the Beautiful makes springtime with his smile. In the north countries, winter, cold, and frost are very real and terrible enemies, while spring, sunshine, and warmth are near and dear friends. So the story of the beginning of things is a story of cold and heat, of the wicked giants who loved the cold, and of the good Aesir who basked in pleasant warmth. In the very beginning of things, the stories say, there were two worlds, one of burning heat and one of icy cold. The cold world was in the north, and from it flowed Elivagar, a river of poisonous water which hardened into ice and piled up into great mountains, filling the space which had no bottom. The other world, in the south, was on fire with bright flame, a place of heat most terrible. And in those days, through all space, there was nothing beside these two worlds of heat and cold. But then began a fierce combat. Heat and cold met, and strove to destroy each other, as they have tried to do ever since. Flaming sparks from the hot world fell upon the ice river which flowed from the place of cold, and though the bright sparks were quenched, in dying they wrought mischief, as they do today, for they melted the ice which dripped and dripped like tears from the suffering world of cold. And then, wonderful to say, these chilly drops became alive, became a huge breathing mass, a frost giant with a wicked heart of ice. And he was the ancestor of all the giants who came afterwards, a bad and cruel race. At that time there was no earth nor sea nor heaven, nothing but the icy abyss without bottom, whence Ymir the giant had sprung. And there he lived, nourished by the milk of a cow which the heat had formed. Now the cow had nothing for her food but the snow and ice of Elivagar, and that was cold victuals indeed. One day she was licking the icy rocks, which tasted salty to her, when Ymir noticed that the mass was taking a strange shape. The more the cow licked it, the plainer became the outline of the shape. And when the evening came, Ymir saw thrusting itself through the icy rock a head of hair. The next day the cow went on with her meal, and at night time a man's head appeared above the rock. On the third day the cow licked away the ice until forth stepped a man, tall and powerful and handsome. This was no evil giant, for he was good, and strangely, though he came from the ice, his heart was warm. He was the ancestor of the kind Aesir, for All-Father Odin and his brothers, Vili and Ve, the first of the gods, were his grandsons, and as soon as they were born, they became the enemies of the race of giants. Now, after a few giant years, ages and ages of time as we reckon it, there was a great battle, For Odin and his brothers wished to destroy all the evil in the world and to leave only good. They attacked the wicked giant Ymir, first of all his race, and after hard fighting slew him. Ymir was so huge that when he died a mighty river of blood flowed from the wounds which Odin had given him, a stream so large that it flooded all space, and the frost giants, his children and grandchildren, were drowned, except one who escaped with his wife in a chest. And but for the saving of these two, that would have been the end of the race of giants. All-Father and his brothers now had work to do. Painfully they dragged the great bulk of Ymir into the bottomless space of ice, and from it they built the earth, the sea, and the heavens. Not an atom of his body went to waste. His blood made the great ocean, the rivers, lakes, and springs. His mighty bones became mountains. His teeth and broken bones made sand and pebbles. And from his skull they fashioned the arching heaven, which they set up over the earth and sea. His brain became the heavy clouds. His hair sprouted into trees, grass, plants, and flowers. And last of all, the Aesir set his bristling eyebrows as a high fence around the earth, to keep the giants away from the race of men whom they had planned to create for this pleasant globe. So the earth was made, and next the gods brought light for the heavens. They caught the sparks and cinders blown from the world of heat, and set them here and there, above and below, as sun and moon and stars. To each they gave its name, and told what its duties were to be, and how it must perform them, day after day, and year after year, and century after century, till the ending of all things, so that the children of men might reckon time without mistake. Sol and Mene, who drove the bright chariots of the sun and moon across the sky, were a fair sister and brother whose father named them Sun and Moon, because they were so beautiful. So Odin gave them each a pair of swift, bright horses to drive, and set them in the sky for ever. Once upon a time, but that was many, many years later, Mani, the man in the moon, stole two children from the earth. Heauki and Bil were going to a well to draw a pail of water. The little boy and girl carried a pole and a bucket across their shoulders, and looked so pretty that Mani thrust down a long arm and snatched them up to his moon. And there they are to this day, as you can see on any moonlight night. Two little black shadows on the moon's bright face, the boy and the girl, with the bucket between them. The gods also made day and night. Day was fair, bright, and beautiful, for he was of the warm-hearted Aesir race, but night was dark and gloomy, because she was one of the cold giant folk. Day and night had each a chariot drawn by a swift horse, and each in turn drove about the world in a 24 hours' journey. Night rode first behind her dark horse, Hrimfaxi, who scattered dew from his bit upon the sleeping earth. After her came Day with his beautiful horse Glad, whose shining mane shot rays of light through the sky. All these wonders the kind gods wrought that they might make a pleasant world for men to call their home. And now the gods, or Aesir as they were called, must choose a place for their own dwelling, for there were many of them, a glorious family. Outside of everything, beyond the great ocean which surrounded the world, was Jotunheim, the cold country where the giants lived. The green earth was made for men. The gods therefore decided to build their city above men in the heavens, where they could watch the doings of their favourites and protect them from the wicked giants. Asgard was to be their city, and from Asgard to Midgard, the home of men, stretched a wonderful bridge, a bridge of many colours. For it was the rainbow that we know and love. Up and down the rainbow bridge the Aesir could travel to the earth, and thus keep close to the doings of men. Next, from the remnants of Ymir's body, the gods made the race of little dwarfs, a wise folk and skilful, but in nature more like the giants than like the good Aesir. For they were spiteful and often wicked, and they loved the dark and the cold better than light and warmth. They lived deep down below the ground in caves and rocky dens, and it was their business to dig the precious metals and glittering gems that were hidden in the rocks, and to make wonderful things from the treasures of the underworld. Poof, poof went the little bellows. Tink, tank went their little hammers on their little anvils all day and all night. Sometimes they were friendly to the giants, and sometimes they did kindly deeds for the Æsir. But always after men came upon the earth, they hated these new folk who eagerly sought for the gold and the jewels which the dwarfs kept hidden in the ground. The dwarfs lost no chance in doing evil to the race of men. Now the gods were ready for the making of men. They longed to have a race of creatures whom they could love and protect and bless with all kinds of pleasures. So Odin, with his brothers Ænir and Loki, crossed the rainbow bridge and came down to the earth. They were walking along the seashore when they found two trees, an ash and an elm. These would do as well as anything for their purpose. Odin took the two trees and warmly breathed upon them, and lo, they were alive, a man and a woman. Ænir then gently touched their foreheads, and they became wise. Lastly, Loki softly stroked their faces. Their skin grew pink with ruddy colour, and they received the gifts of speech, hearing, and sight. Ask and Embla were their names, and the ash and the elm became the father and mother of the whole human race, whose dwelling was Midgard, under the eyes of the Æsir who had made them. This is the story of the beginning of things. End of The Beginning of Things by Abby Farwell Brown.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. Fifth Day, Novel 9, Federigo's Hawk. The Queen, now observing that only herself and Dionaeus were left to speak, said pleasantly to this effect: "As it is now come to my turn, I shall give you a novel something like the preceding one, that you may not only know what influence the power of your charms has over a generous heart, but that you may learn likewise to bestow your favours of your own accord, and where you think most proper, without suffering fortune to be your directress, who disposes blindly and without the least judgment whatsoever. You must understand, then, that Capo di Borghese, who was a person of great respect and authority among us, and whose amiable qualities, joined to his noble birth, had rendered him worthy of immortal fame in the decline of life, used to divert himself among his neighbours and acquaintances by relating things which had happened in his days, and which he knew how to do with more exactness and elegance of expression than any other person. He, I say, amongst other pleasant stories, used to tell us that at Florence dwelt a young gentleman named Federigo, son of Filippo Alberighi, who in feats of arms and gentility surpassed all the youth in Tuscany. This gentleman was in love with a lady called Madame Giovanna, one of the most agreeable women in Florence, and to gain her affection used to be continually making tilts, balls, and such diversions, lavishing away his money in rich presents, and everything that was extravagant. But she, as just and reputable as she was fair, made no account either of what he did for her sake, or of himself. Living in this manner, his wealth soon began to waste, till at last he had nothing left but a very small farm, the income of which was a most slender maintenance, and a single hawk, one of the best in the world. Yet loving still more than ever, and finding he could subsist no longer in the city in the manner he would choose to live, he retired to his farm, where he went out a-fowling as often as the weather would permit, and bore his distress patiently, and without ever making his necessity known to anybody. Now one day it happened that, as he was reduced to the last extremity, the husband to this lady chanced to fall sick, who, being very rich, left all his substance to an only son, who was almost grown up, and if he should die without issue, he then ordered that it should revert to his lady, whom he was extremely fond of, and when he had disposed thus of his fortune he died. She now, being left a widow, retired, as our ladies usually do during the summer season, to a house of hers in the country, near to that of Federigo, whence it happened that her son soon became acquainted with him, and they used to divert themselves together with dogs and hawks, when he, having often seen Federigo's hawk fly, and being strangely taken with it, was desirous of having it, though the other valued it to that degree, that he knew not how to ask for it. This being so, the young spark soon fell sick, which gave his mother great concern, as he was her only child, and she ceased not to attend on and comfort him, often requesting, if there was any particular thing which he fancied, to let her know it, and promising to procure it for him if it were possible. The young gentleman, after many offers of this kind, at last said, "Madam, if you would contrive for me to have Federigo's hawk, I should soon be well." She was in some suspense at this, and began to consider how best to act. She knew that Federigo had long entertained a liking for her, without the least encouragement on her part. Therefore she said to herself, "How can I send or go to ask for this hawk, which I hear is the very best of the kind, and what alone maintains him in the world? Or how can I offer to take away from a gentleman all the pleasure that he has in life?" Being in this perplexity, though she was very sure of having it for a word, she stood without making any reply, till at last the love of her son so far prevailed, that she resolved at all events to make him easy, and not send, but go herself to bring it. She then replied, "Son, set your heart at rest, and think only of your recovery, for I promise you that I will go to-morrow for it the first thing I do." This afforded him such joy that he immediately showed signs of amendment. The next morning she went, by way of a walk, with another lady in company, to his little cottage to inquire for him. At that time, as it was too early to go out upon his diversion, he was at work in his garden. Hearing, therefore, that his mistress inquired for him at the door, he ran thither, surprised and full of joy, whilst she, with a great deal of complaisance, went to meet him, and after the usual compliments, she said, "Good morning to you, sir. I am come to make you some amends for what you have formerly done on my account. What I mean is, that I have brought you a companion to take a neighbourly dinner with you to-day." He replied with a great deal of humility, "Madame, I do not remember ever to have received any harm by your means, but rather so much good, that if I was worth anything at any time, it was due to your singular merit, and the love I had for you. And most assuredly this courteous visit is more welcome to me than if I had all that I have wasted returned to me to spend over again. But you are come to a very poor host." With these words he showed her into his house, seeming much out of countenance, and from thence they went into the garden, when, having no company for her, he said, "Madam, as I have nobody else, please to admit this honest woman, a labourer's wife, to be with you, whilst I set forth the table." He, although his poverty was extreme, was never so sensible of his having been extravagant as now. But finding nothing to entertain the lady with, for whose sake he had treated thousands, he was in the utmost perplexity, cursing his evil fortune, and running up and down like one out of his wits. At length, having neither money nor anything he could pawn, and being willing to give her something, at the same time that he would not make his case known, even so much as to his own labourer, he espied his hawk upon the perch, which he seized, and finding it very fat, judged it might make a dish not unworthy of such a lady. Without further thought, then, he pulled his head off, and gave him to a girl to truss and roast carefully, whilst he laid the cloth, having a small quantity of linen yet left, and then he returned with a smile on his countenance in the garden to her, telling her what little dinner he was able to provide was now ready. She and her friend therefore entered and sat down with him. He served them all the time with great respect, when they eat the hawk. After dinner was over, and they had sat chattering a little together, she thought it a fit time to tell her errand, and she spoke to him courteously in this manner: "Sir, if you call to mind your past life and my resolution, which perhaps you may call cruelty, I doubt not but you will wonder at my presumption when you know what I am come for. But if you had children of your own, to know how strong our natural affection is towards them, I am very sure you would excuse me. Now my having a son forces me, against my own inclinations and all reasons whatsoever, to request a thing of you which I know you value extremely, as you have no other comfort or diversion left in your small circumstances. I mean your hawk. which he has taken such a fancy to, that unless I bring him back with me, I very much fear that he will die of his disorder. Therefore I entreat you, not for any regard you have for me, for in that respect you are in no way obliged to me, but for that generosity with which you have always distinguished yourself, that you would please to let me have him, by which means you will save my child's life and lay him under perpetual obligations." Federigo, hearing the lady's request, and knowing it was out of his power to serve her, began to weep before he was able to make a word of reply. This she first thought was his great concern, to part with his favourite bird, and that he was going to give her a flat denial. But after she had waited a little for his answer, he said, "Madame, ever since I have fixed my affections upon you, fortune has still been contrary to me in many things, but all the rest is nothing to what has now come to pass. You are here to visit me in this my poor mansion, and whither in your prosperity you would never deign to come, you also entreat a small present from me, which it is no way in my power to give, as I am briefly going to tell you. As soon as I was acquainted with the great favour you designed me, I thought it proper, considering your superior merit and excellency, to treat you according to my ability, with something more nice and valuable than is usually given to other persons, when calling to mind my hawk, which you now request, and his goodness, I judged him a fit repast for you, and you have had him roasted. Nor could I have thought him better bestowed had you not now desired him in a different manner, which is such a grief to me that I shall never be at peace as long as I live." And upon saying this, he produced his feathers, feet, and talons. She began now to blame him for killing such a bird to entertain any woman with, secretly praising the greatness of his soul, which poverty had no power to abase. Thus, having no further hopes of obtaining the hawk, she thanked him for the respect and good will he had shown towards her, and returned full of concern to her son, who, either out of grief for the disappointment, or through the violence of his disorder, died in a few days. She continued sorrowful for some time, but being left rich and young, her brothers were very pressing with her to marry again, which, though against her inclinations, yet finding them still importunate, and remembering Federigo's great worth, and the late instance of his generosity in killing such a bird for her entertainment, she said, "I should rather choose to continue as I am. But since it is your desire that I take a husband, I will have only Federico degli Alberighi." They smiled contemptuously at this, and said, "You simple woman, what are you talking of? He is not worth 1 farthing in the world." She replied, "I believe it, brothers, to be as you say, but know that I would sooner have a man that stands in need of riches than riches without a man." They, hearing her resolution, and well knowing his generous temper, gave her to him with all her wealth, and he, seeing himself possessed of a lady whom he had so dearly loved, and such a vast fortune, lived in all true happiness with her, and was a better manager of his affairs for the time to come. End of Federico's Hawk. Recording by Philip Gould.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Davis and Nemo. In the Home Stretch by Robert Frost. She stood against the kitchen sink and looked over the sink out through a dusty window at weeds the water from the sink made tall. She wore her cape. Her hat was in her hand. Behind her was confusion in the room, of chairs turned upside down to sit like people in other chairs, and something, come to look, for every room a house has, parlor, bedroom, and dining room, thrown pell-mell in the kitchen. And now and then a smudged infernal face looked in a door behind her and addressed her back. She always answered without turning. "Where will I put this walnut bureau, lady?"
"Put it on top of something that's on top of something else,"
she laughed.
"Oh, put it where you can tonight, and go. It's almost dark. You must be getting started back to town."
Another blackened face thrust in and looked and smiled, and when she did not turn, spoke gently. What are you seeing out the window, lady?
Never was I beladied so before. Would evidence of having been called lady more than so many times make me a lady in common law, I wonder?
But I ask, what are you seeing out the window, lady?
What I'll be seeing more of in the years to come is here I stand and go the round of many plates with towels, many times.
And what is that? You only put me off.
Rank weeds that love the water from the dishpan more than some women like the dishpan, Joe. A little stretch of mowing field for you, not much of that until I come to woods that end all, and it's scarce enough to call a view.
And yet you think you like it, dear?
That's what you're so concerned to know. You hope I like it. Bang goes something big away off there upstairs. The very tread of men as great as these is shattering to the frame of such a little house. Once left alone, you and I, dear, will go with softer steps, up and down stairs and through the rooms, and none but sudden winds that snatch them from our hands will ever slam the doors.
I think you see more than you like to own to out that window.
No, for besides the things I tell you of, I only see the years. They come and go in alternation with the weeds, the field, the wood.
What kind of years?
Why, latter years, different from early years.
I see them too. You didn't count them.
No, the further off so ran together that I didn't try to. It can scarce be that there would be a number we'd care to know, for we are not young now. And bang goes something else away off there. It sounds as if it were the men went down, and every crash meant one less to return to lighted city streets we too have known, but now are giving up for country darkness.
Come from that window, where you see too much for me, and take a livelier view of things from here. They're going. Watch this husky swarming up over the wheel into the sky-high seat, lighting his pipe now, squinting down his nose, at the flame burning downward as he sucks it.
See how it makes his nose side bright, a proof how dark it's getting. Can you tell what time it is by that? Or by the moon? The new moon. What shoulder did I see her over? Neither. A wire she is of silver, as new as we to everything. Her light won't last us long. It's something, though, to know we're going to have her, night after night, and stronger every night, to see us through our first 2 weeks. But, Joe, the stove, before they go, knock on the window, ask them to help you get it on its feet. We stand here dreaming. Hurry, call them back.
They're not gone yet.
We've got to have the stove, whatever else we want for. And a light. Have we a piece of candle if the lamp and oil are buried out of reach?
Again, the house was full of tramping, and the dark, door-filling men burst in and seized the stove. A cannon-mouth-like hole was in the wall, to which they set it true by eye, and then came up the jointed stovepipe in their hands, so much too light and airy for their strength, it almost seemed to come ballooning up, slipping from clumsy clutches toward the ceiling. "A fit," said one, and banged a stovepipe shoulder. "It's good luck when you move in to begin with good luck with your stovepipe. Never mind, it's not so bad in the country. Settle down, when people are getting on in life, you'll like it." Joe said, "You big boys ought to find a farm, and make good farmers, and leave other fellows the city work to do. There's not enough for everybody as it is in there." "God!" one said wildly, and when no one spoke, "Say that to Jimmy here. He needs a farm." But Jimmy only made his jaw recede, fool-like, and rolled his eyes as if to say he saw himself a farmer. Then there was a French boy, who said with seriousness that made them laugh, "Ma friend, you ain't know what it is you ask." He doffed his cap, and held it with both hands across his chest, to make as 'twere a bow. "We're giving you our chances on de farm." And then they all turned to with deafening boots, and put each other bodily out of the house. Goodbye to them. We puzzle them. They think. I don't know what they think we see and what they leave us to. That pasture slope that seems the back some farm presents us, and your woods to northward from your window at the sink, waiting to steal a step on us whenever we drop our eyes or turn to other things, as in the game 10-step the children play.
Good boys they seemed, and let them love the city. All they could say was God when you proposed their coming out and making useful farmers.
Did they make something lonesome go through you? It would take more than them to sicken you, us, of our bargain. But they left us so as to our fate, like fools past reasoning with. They almost shook me.
It's all so much what we have always wanted. I confess, its seeming bad for a moment makes it seem even worse still, and so on, down, down, down. It's nothing. It's their leaving us at dusk. I never bore it well when people went. The first night after guests have gone, the house seems haunted or exposed. I always take a personal interest in the locking up at bedtime, but the strangeness soon wears off.
He fetched a dingy lantern from behind a door. There's that we didn't lose, and these. Some matches he unpocketed. For food, the meals we've had no one can take from us. I wish that everything on earth were just as certain as the meals we've had. I wish the meals we haven't had were, anyway. What have you? You know where to lay your hands on.
The bread we bought in passing at the store. There's butter somewhere, too.
Let's rend the bread. I'll light the fire for company for you. You'll not have any other company till Ed begins to get out on a Sunday, to look us over and give us his idea of what wants pruning, shingling, breaking up. He'll know what he would do if he were we, and all at once. He'll plan for us and plan to help us, but he'll take it out in planning. Well, you can set the table with a loaf. Let's see you find your loaf. I'll light the fire. I like chairs occupying other chairs, not offering a lady.
There again, Joe. You're tired.
I'm drunk, nonsensical, tired out. Don't mind a word I say. It's a day's work to empty one house of all household goods and fill another with 'em 15 miles away, although you do no more than dump 'em down.
Dumped down in paradise we are, and happy.
It's all so much what I've always wanted. I can't believe it's what you wanted too.
Shouldn't you like to know?
I'd like to know, if it is what you wanted, then how much you wanted it for me.
A troubled conscience. You don't want me to tell if I don't know.
I don't want to find out what can't be known. But who first said the word to come?
My dear, it's who first thought the thought. You're searching, Joe, for things that don't exist. I mean beginnings, ends and beginnings. There are no such things. There are only middles.
What is this?
This life, our sitting here by lantern light together, amid the wreckage of a former home. You won't deny the lantern isn't new. The stove is not, and you are not to me, nor I to you.
Perhaps you never were.
It would take me forever to recite all that's not new and where we find ourselves. New is a word for fools in towns who think style upon style in dress and thought at last must get somewhere. I've heard you say as much. No, this is no beginning.
Then an end?
End is a gloomy word.
Is it too late to drag you out for just a good-night call on the old peach trees on the knoll, to grope by starlight in the grass for a last peach the neighbors may not have taken as their right when the house wasn't lived in? I've been looking. I doubt if they have left us many grapes. Before we set ourselves to right the house, the first thing in the morning, out we go to go the round of apple, cherry, peach, pine, alder, pasture, mowing, well and brook. All of a farm it is.
I know this much. I'm going to put you in your bed if first I have to make you build it. Come, the light.
When there was no more lantern in the kitchen, the fire got out through crannies in the stove and danced in yellow wrigglers on the ceiling, as much at home as if they'd always danced there. End of In the Homestretch.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. In the Morning, by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Lias! Lias! Bless the Lord! Don't you know the day's abroad? If you don't get up, you scamp, there'll be trouble in this camp. Think I's going to let you sleep while I makes your board and keep? Dat's a purty howdy do. Don't you hear me, Lias, you? Bet if I come cross dis floor, you won't find no time to snore. Daylight all a-shinin' in while you sleep, why, hit's a sin. Ain't the candlelight enough to burn out without a snuff, but you go the mornin' through, burnin' up the daylight too. Lias, don't you hear me call? No use turnin' towards the wall. I can hear dat matter squeak. Don't you hear me when I speak? Dis here clock done struck off 6. Caroline, bring me dem all sticks. Oh, you's down, sir, huh? You's down. Look here, don't you dare to frown. March yourself and wash your face. Don't you splatter all de place. I got somepin' else to do, sides just cleanin' after you. Take dat comb and fix your head. Looks des like a feather bed. Look here, boy, I let you see. You can't roll your eyes at me. Come here, bring me that all strap. Boy, I'll whoop you till you drop. You done felt yourself too strong, and you surely got me wrong. Set down at that table there. Just you whimper if you dare. Every morning on this place seems like I must lose my grace. Fold your hands and bow your head. Wait until the blessing said. Lord have mercy on our souls. Don't you dare to touch them rolls. Bless the food we's going to eat. You set still, I see your feet. Just you try that trick again. Gin us peace and joy. Amen. End of In the Morning. Recording by Devorah Allen.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Last Lesson by Alphonse Daudet. I started for school very late that morning and was in great dread of a scolding, especially because Monsieur Hamel had said that he would question us on participles, and I did not know the first word about them. For a moment I thought of running away and spending the day out of doors. It was so warm, so bright. The birds were chirping at the edge of the woods, and in the open field back of the sawmill the Prussian soldiers were drilling. It was all much more tempting than the rule for participles. But I had the strength to resist, and hurried off to school. When I passed the town hall, there was a crowd in front of the bulletin board. For the last 2 years all our bad news had come from there, the lost battles, the draft, the orders of the commanding officer, and I thought to myself, without stopping, what can be the matter now? Then, as I hurried by as fast as I could go, the blacksmith, Wachter, who was there with his apprentice reading the bulletin, called after me, "Don't go so fast, bub. You'll get to your school in plenty of time." I thought he was making fun of me, and reached Monsieur Hamel's little garden all out of breath. Usually when school began there was a great bustle, which could be heard out in the street, the opening and closing of desks, lessons repeated in unison, very loud, with our hands over our ears to understand better, and the teacher's great ruler rapping on the table. But now it was all so still. I had counted on the commotion to get to my desk without being seen. But of course, that day everything had to be as quiet as Sunday morning. Through the window I saw my classmates already in their places, and Monsieur Hamel walking up and down with his terrible iron ruler under his arm. I had to open the door and go in before everybody. You can imagine how I blushed, and how frightened I was. But nothing happened. Monsieur Hamel saw me, and said very kindly, "Go to your place quickly, little Franz. We were beginning without you." I jumped over the bench and sat down at my desk. Not till then, when I had got a little over my fright, did I see that our teacher had on his beautiful green coat, his frilled shirt, and the little black silk cap all embroidered that he never wore except on inspection and prize days. Besides, the whole school seemed so strange and solemn. But the thing that surprised me most was to see on the back benches, that were always empty, the village people sitting quietly like ourselves. Old Hauser with his three-cornered hat, the former mayor, the former postmaster, and several others besides. Everybody looked sad, and Hauser had brought an old primer, thumbed at the edges, and he held it open on his knees with his great spectacles lying across the pages. While I was wondering about it all, Monsieur Hamel mounted his chair, and in the same grave and gentle tone which he had used to me, said, "My children, this is the last lesson I shall give you. The order has come from Berlin to teach only German in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. The new master comes tomorrow. This is your last French lesson. I want you to be very attentive." What a thunderclap these words were to me! Oh, the wretches! That was what they had put up at the town hall. My last French lesson! Why, I hardly knew how to write. I should never learn any more. I must stop there. Then! Oh, how sorry I was for not learning my lessons, for seeking birds' eggs, or going sliding on the Saar. My books, that had seemed such a nuisance a while ago, so heavy to carry, my grammar and my history of the saints, were old friends now that I couldn't give up. And Monsieur Hamel, too. The idea that he was going away, that I should never see him again, made me forget all about his ruler and how cranky he was. Poor man! It was in honor of this last lesson that he had put on his fine Sunday clothes, and now I understood why the old men of the village were sitting there in the back of the room. It was because they were sorry, too, that they had not gone to school more. It was their way of thanking our master for his 40 years of faithful service, and of showing their respect for the country that was theirs no more. While I was thinking of all this, I heard my name called. It was my turn to recite. What would I not have given to be able to say that dreadful rule for the participle all through, very loud and clear, and without one mistake? But I got mixed up on the first words, and stood there holding on to my desk, my heart beating and not daring to look up. I heard Monsieur Hamel say to me, "I won't scold you, little Franz. You must feel bad enough. See how it is. Every day we have said to ourselves, 'Bah! I've plenty of time. I'll learn it tomorrow.' And now you see where we've come out. Ah, that's the great trouble with Alsace. She puts off learning till tomorrow. Now those fellows out there will have the right to say to you, 'How is it you pretend to be Frenchmen, and yet you can neither speak nor write your own language?' But you are not the worst, poor little Franz. We've all a great deal to reproach ourselves with. Your parents were not anxious enough to have you learn. They preferred to put you to work on a farm or at the mills so as to have a little more money. And I've been to blame also. Have I not often sent you to water my flowers instead of learning your lessons? And when I wanted to go fishing, did I not just give you a holiday?" Then from one thing to another Monsieur Hamel went on to talk of the French language, saying that it was the most beautiful language in the world, the clearest, the most logical, that we must guard it among us and never forget it, because when a people are enslaved, as long as they hold fast to their language, it is as if they had the key to their prison. Then he opened a grammar and read us our lesson. I was amazed to see how well I understood it. All he said seemed so easy, so easy. I think, too, that I had never listened so carefully, and that he had never explained everything with so much patience. It seemed almost as if the poor man wanted to give us all he knew before going away. and to put it all into our heads at one stroke. After the grammar we had a lesson in writing. That day Monsieur Hamel had new copies for us, written in a beautiful round hand. France, Alsace, France, Alsace. They looked like little flags floating everywhere in the schoolroom, hung from the rod at the top of our desks. You ought to have seen how everyone set to work, and how quiet it was. The only sound was the scratching of the pens over the paper. Once some beetles flew in, but nobody paid any attention to them, not even the littlest ones, who worked right on tracing their fish-hooks, as if that was French, too. On the roof the pigeons cooed very low, and I thought to myself, will they make them sing in German? Even the pigeons? Whenever I looked up from my writing, I saw Monsieur Hamel sitting motionless in his chair and gazing, first at one thing, then at another, as if he wanted to fix in his mind just how everything looked in that little schoolroom. Fancy! For 40 years he had been there in the same place, with his garden outside the window and his class in front of him, just like that. Only the desks and benches had been worn smooth, the walnut trees in the garden were taller, and the hop vine that he had planted himself twined about the windows to the roof. How it must have broken his heart to leave it all, poor man! To hear his sister moving about in the room above packing their trunks, for they must leave the country next day. But he had the courage to hear every lesson to the very last. After the writing we had a lesson in history, and then the babies chanted their ba, be, bee, bo, boo. Down there at the back of the room old Hauser had put on his spectacles, and holding his primer in both hands, spelled the letters with them. You could see that he too was crying. His voice trembled with emotion, and it was so funny to hear him that we all wanted to laugh and cry. Ah, how well I remember it, that last lesson. All at once the church clock struck 12. Then the Angelus. At the same moment the trumpets of the Prussians, returning from drill, sounded under our windows. Monsieur Hamel stood up, very pale, in his chair. I never saw him look so tall. "My friends," said he, I... But something choked him. He could not go on. Then he turned to the blackboard, took a piece of chalk, and bearing on with all his might, he wrote as large as he could, "Vive la France." Then he stopped, and leaned his head against the wall, and, without a word, he made a gesture to us with his hand. "School is dismissed. You may go." End of the last lesson by Alphonse Daudet. Recording by Philip Gould.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Algie Pug. My Battle with Drink by P.G. Woodhouse. I could tell my story in 2 words, the words, I drank. But I was not always a drinker. This is the story of my downfall, and of my rise, for through the influence of a good woman I have, thank heaven, risen from the depths. The thing stole upon me gradually, as it does upon so many young men. As a boy, I remember taking a glass of root beer, but it did not grip me then. I can recall that I even disliked the taste. I was a young man before temptation really came upon me. My downfall began when I joined the Yonkers Shorthand and Typewriting College. It was then that I first made acquaintance with the awful power of ridicule. They were a hard-living set at college, reckless youths. They frequented movie palaces. They thought nothing of winding up an evening with a couple of egg phosphates and a chocolate fudge. They laughed at me when I refused to join them. I was only 20. My character was undeveloped. I could not endure their scorn. The next time I was offered a drink, I accepted. They were pleased, I remember. They called me "good old Plum," and a good sport, and other complimentary names. I was intoxicated with sudden popularity. How vividly I can recall that day! The shining counter, the placards advertising strange mixtures with ice cream as their basis, the busy men behind the counter, the half-cynical, half-pitying eyes of the girl in the cage where you bought the soda checks. She had seen so many happy, healthy boys through that little hole in the wire netting, so many thoughtless boys, all eager for their first soda, clamouring to set their foot on the primrose path that leads to destruction. It was an apple marshmallow sundae, I recollect. I dug my spoon into it with an assumption of gaiety which I was far from feeling. The first mouthful almost nauseated me. It was like cold hair oil. But I stuck to it. I could not break down now. I could not bear to forfeit the newly won esteem of my comrades. They were gulping their sundaes down with the speed and exhilaration of old hands. I set my teeth, and persevered, and by degrees a strange exhilaration began to steal over me. I felt that I had burnt my boats and bridges, that I had crossed the Rubicon. I was reckless. I ordered another round. I was the life and soul of that party. The next morning brought remorse. I did not feel well. I had pains, physical and mental. But I could not go back now. I was too weak to dispense with my popularity. I was only a boy, and on the previous evening the captain of the Checkers Club, to whom I looked up with an almost worshipping reverence, had slapped me on the back and told me I was a corker. I felt that nothing could be excessive payment for such an honour. That night I gave a party at which orange phosphate flowed like water. It was the turning point. I had got the habit. I will pass briefly over the next few years. I continued to sink deeper and deeper into the slough. I knew all the drug-store clerks in New York by their first names, and they called me by mine. I no longer even had to specify the abomination I desired. I simply handed the man my 10-cent cheque and said, "The usual, Jimmy," and he understood. At first, considerations of health did not trouble me. I was young and strong, and my constitution quickly threw off the effects of my dissipation. Then, gradually, I began to feel worse. I was losing my grip. I found the difficulty in concentrating my attention on my work. I had dizzy spells. I became nervous and distrait. Eventually I went to a doctor. He examined me thoroughly and shook his head. "If I am to do you any good," he said, "you must tell me all. You must hold no secrets from me." "Doctor," I said, covering my face with my hands, "I am a confirmed soda fiend." He gave me a long lecture and a longer list of instructions. I must take air and exercise, and I must become a total abstainer from sundaes of all descriptions. I must avoid limeade like the plague, and if anybody offered me a bulgazoon, I was to knock him down and shout for the nearest policeman. I learned then, for the first time, what a bitterly hard thing it is for a man in the large and wicked city to keep from soda when once he has got the habit. Everything was against me. The old convivial circle began to shun me. I could not join in their revels, and they began to look on me as a grouch. In the end I fell, and in one wild orgy undid all the good of a month's abstinence. I was desperate then. I felt that nothing could save me, and I might as well give up the struggle. I drank 2 pineappolides, 3 grapefruit azolas, and an egg zoulac before pausing to take breath. And then, the next day, I met May, the girl who effected my reformation. She was a clergyman's daughter, who, to support her widowed mother, had accepted a non-speaking part in a musical comedy production entitled "Oh Joy, Oh Pep." Our acquaintance ripened, and one night I asked her out to supper. I look on that moment as the happiest of my life. I met her at the stage door and conducted her to the nearest soda fountain. We were inside and I was buying the cheques before she realised where she was, and I shall never forget her look of mingled pain and horror. "And I thought you were a live one," she murmured. It seemed that she had been looking forward to a little lobster and champagne. The idea was absolutely new to me. She quickly convinced me, however, that such was the only refreshment which she would consider, and she recoiled with unconcealed aversion from my suggestion of a mocha malted and an Eva Tanguay. That night I tasted wine for the first time, and my reformation began. It was hard at first, desperately hard. Something inside me was trying to pull me back to the Sundays for which I craved, but I resisted the impulse. Always with her divinely sympathetic encouragement, I gradually acquired a taste for alcohol. And suddenly, one evening, like a flash it came upon me that I had shaken off the cursed yoke that held me down, that I never wanted to see the inside of a drugstore again. Cocktails, at first repellent, have at last become palatable to me. I drink highballs for breakfast. I am saved. End of My Battle with Drink. Recording by Algie Pug.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. New Every Morning by Susan Coolidge. Every day is a fresh beginning. Every morn is the world made new. You, who are weary of sorrow and sinning, here is a beautiful hope for you. A hope for me, and a hope for you. All the past things are past and over. The tasks are done, and the tears are shed. Yesterday's errors let yesterday cover. Yesterday's wounds, which smarted and bled, are healed with the healing which night has shed. Yesterday now is a part of forever, bound up in a sheaf which God holds tight. With glad days and sad days and bad days which never shall visit us more with their bloom and their blight, their fullness of sunshine or sorrowful night. Let them go, since we cannot relive them, cannot undo and cannot atone. God in His mercy receive, forgive them. Only the new days are our own. Today is ours, and today alone. Here are the skies all burnished brightly. Here is the spent earth all reborn. Here are the tired limbs springing lightly to face the sun, and to share with the morn in the chrism of dew and the cool of dawn. Every day is a fresh beginning. Listen, my soul, to the glad refrain, and spite of old sorrow and older sinning, and puzzles forecasted and possible pain, take heart with the day, and begin again. End of poem. Read by Philip Gould.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. A New Year Idyll by Eugene Field. Upon this happy New Year night, a roach crawls up my pot of paste, and begs me for a tiny taste. Ay, eat thy fill, for it is right, that while the rest of earth is glad, and bells are ringing wild and free, thou shouldst not, gentle roachling, be forlorn and gaunt and weak and sad. This paste to-night especially, for thee and all thy kind I fixed. You'll find some whiskey in it mixed, for which you have to thank but me. So freely of the banquet take, and if you chance to find a drop of liquor, prithee do not stop, but quaff it for thy stomach's sake. Why dost thou stand upon thy head, all etiquette requirements scorning, and sing you won't go home till morning, and put me in my little bed. Your tongue, fair roach, is very thick, your eyes are red, your cheeks are pale, your underpinning seems to fail. You are, I wot, full as a tick. Envoy. I think I see that roach's home, that roach's wife with broom in hand. That roach comes staggering homeward, and then all is glum and gloom and gloom. End of A New Year Idyll.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nemo. New Year's Morning by Helen Hunt Jackson. Only a night from old to new, only a night and so much wrought. The old year's heart all weary grew, but said, the new year rest is brought. The old year's hopes its hearts laid down, as in a grave, but trusting said, the blossoms of the new year's crown bloom from the ashes of the dead. The old year's heart was full of greed, with selfishness it longed and ached, and cried, I have not half I need, my thirst is bitter and unslaked. But to the new year's generous hand all gifts in plenty shall return, true love it shall understand, by all your failures it shall learn. I have been reckless, it shall be quiet and calm and pure of life. I was a slave, it shall go free, and find sweet pace where I leave strife. Only a night from old to new, never a night such changes brought. The old year had its work to do, no new year miracles are wrought. Always a night from old to new, night in the healing balm of sleep. Each morn is New Year's morn come true, morn of a festival to keep. All nights are sacred nights to make confession and resolve in prayer. All days are sacred days to wake new gladness in the sunny air. Only a night from old to new, only a sleep from night to morn. The new is but the old come true. Each sunrise sees a new year born. End of New Year's Morning.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Origin of the Prime Minister by Arthur Guy Terry. As George I could not speak English, and detested English politics, he left off presiding at the meetings of his ministers, at which affairs of public importance were discussed. Now, when men meet for business, there must always be someone to preside, else there can be no order. Who was to direct the meetings of the ministers? Gradually, as Walpole became more and more important, he directed the meetings of the ministers, and was called the First or Prime Minister. Before Walpole's time the King's ministers had all been equal, and had had to obey only the King or Queen. But from that time onward the position of Prime Minister has become more and more important, until now he directs a good deal of the action of the other ministers. In fact, the whole ministry now acts under the general guidance of the Prime Minister, and the chief ministers form what is called a cabinet. So that, because George I and later on George II trusted Walpole with the control of business for 21 years, there came this great change in English public life, and the Prime Minister has latterly had far more to do with public affairs than the reigning sovereign. We must notice one other result of Walpole's long control of public affairs. Before his time the king or queen often used to forbid the passing of a law, but since then this has hardly ever been done. George I. and then George II. trusted Walpole to look after their interests. Therefore it came to be the custom for the king always to give his assent to bills passed by Parliament. Thus the king's power became less, while that of Parliament and of the king's ministers became greater and greater. Remember, then, that in Walpole's time we see the English system of government taking its present form. The British owe much to Sir Robert Walpole in other ways. He was the first English minister who encouraged commerce by letting raw material come into the country more freely, so that manufactured goods became better and cheaper than ever before. He also made it easier to export manufactures, and before very long the value of exports rose from $30 million a year to more than $60 million. The colonies also had some privileges granted to them for their trade, and altogether the British Empire grew greatly in wealth and power during the long ministry of Walpole. But his very success raised up many enemies, who were jealous of him, and tried to poison the public mind against him. This was the case when he proposed a very useful reform in the collection of part of the taxes, so as to check smuggling. At that time money had to be paid to government officers on many articles before they might legally be landed. The sums which then had to be paid on silks, brandy, rum, tea, tobacco, were so large that those articles were often smuggled in secretly so as to evade the law. As this caused a great loss of revenue, Walpole proposed to tax these articles when they were in the country, and not at the ports. But many people had a violent dislike to any such change, and as a great clamour was raised, he thought it best to drop his measure. Troubles in Scotland, and disputes between George II. And his son the Prince of Wales, also added to his difficulties, and after a long fight against his foes, he had to resign (1742). King George II. was deeply grieved at losing his trusty adviser, and, falling on his neck, he kissed him and begged to see him frequently. Men soon found out how unable his foes were to take his place, and matters went from bad to worse for the next few years. After 3 years of retirement, death overtook the statesman who had done so much for the peace and prosperity of his country. Englishmen regretted his downfall, until a greater statesman came to power. William Pitt, Earl of Chatham. End of The Origin of the Prime Minister.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick Wallace. Say Not the Struggle Naught Availeth by A.H. Clough. Say not the struggle naught availeth, the labour and the wounds are vain, the enemy faints not nor faileth, and as things have been they remain. If hopes were dupes, fears may be liars. It may be in yon smoke concealed, your comrades chase e'en now the flyers, and, but for you, possess the field. For while the tired waves, vainly breaking, seem here no painful inch to gain, far back, through creeks and inlets making, comes silent, flooding in the main. And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs, slow, how slowly! But westward, look, the land is bright. End of Say not the struggle naught availeth.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Selecting the Faculty by Baynard Rust Hall. Our Board of Trustees, it will be remembered, had been directed by the legislature to procure, as the ordinance called it, teachers for the commencement of the State College at Woodville. That business by the board was committed to Dr. Sylvan and Robert Carleton, the most learned gentlemen of the body, and of the new purchase. Our honorable board will be more specifically introduced hereafter. At present we shall bring forward certain rejected candidates, that, like rejected prize essays, they may be published, and thus have their revenge. None can tell us how plenty good things are till he looks for them. And hence, to the great surprise of the committee, there seemed to be a sudden growth and a large crop of persons, even in and around Woodville, either already qualified for the professorships, as we named them in our publication, or who could qualify by the time of election. As to the chair, named also in our publications, one very worthy and disinterested schoolmaster offered, as a great collateral inducement for his being elected, to find his own chair. A vast saving to the state, if the same chair I saw in Mr. Wackham's schoolroom. For his chair there was one with a hickory bottom, and doubtless he would have filled it, and even lapped over its edges with equal dignity in the recitation room of Big College. The committee had at an early day given an invitation to the Rev. Charles Clarence, A.M. of New Jersey, and his answer had been affirmative. Yet for political reasons we had been obligated to invite competitors, or make them, and we found and created a right smart sprinkle. Hopes of success were built on many things, for instance, on poverty, a plea being entered that something ought to be done for the poor fellow, on one's having taught a common school all his born days, who now deserved to rise a peg, on political, or religious, or fanatical partisan qualifications, and on pure patriotic principles, such as a person having been born in a cane-brake and rocked in a sugar-trough. On the other hand, a fat, dull-headed, and modest Englishman asked for a place, because he had been born in Liverpool, and had seen the world beyond the woods and waters too. And another fussy, talkative, pragmatical little gentleman rested his pretensions on his ability to draw and paint maps, not projecting them in roundabout scientific processes, but in that speedy and elegant style in which young ladies copy maps at first chop boarding schools. Nay, so transcendent seemed Mr. Mercator's claims, when his show or sample maps were exhibited to us, that some in our board, and nearly everybody out of it, were confident he would do for professor of mathematics and even principal. But of all our unsuccessful candidates we shall introduce by name only two, Mr. James Jimmy, A.S.S., and Mr. Solomon Rapid, A to Z. Mr. Jimmy, who aspired to the mathematical chair, was master of a small school of all sexes near Woodville. At the first he was kindly, yet honestly told his knowledge was too limited and inaccurate. Yet notwithstanding this, and some almost rude repulses afterwards, he persisted in his application and his hopes. To give evidence of competency, he once told me he was arranging a new spelling book, the publication of which would make him known as a literary man and be an unspeakable advantage to the rising generation. And this naturally brought on the following colloquy about the work. Ah, indeed, Mr. Jimmy. Yes, indeed, Mr. Carleton. On what new principle do you go, sir? Why, sir, on the principles of nature and common sense. I allow school books for schools are all too powerful abstruse and hard-like to be understood without exemplifying illustrations. Yes, but Mr. Jimmy, how was a child's spelling book to be made any plainer? Why, sir, by clear exemplification of the words in one column, by exemplifying illustrations in the other. I do not understand you, Mr. Jimmy. Give me a specimen. Sir, an example. To be sure. Here's a example. You see, for instance, I put in the spelling column C-R-E-D, cream. And here in the exemplification column I put the exemplifying illustration, unctuous part of milk. We had asked at our first interview if our candidate was an algebraist, and his reply was negative. But he allowed he could qualify by the time of election, as he was powerful good at figures and had ciphered clean through every arithmetic he had ever seen, the rule of promiscuous questions and all. Hence, some weeks after, as I was passing his door on my way to a squirrel hunt with a party of friends, Mr. Jimmy, hurrying out with a slate in his hand, begged me to stop a moment, and thus addressed me. "Well, Mr. Carleton, this algebra is a most powerful thing, ain't it?" "Indeed it is, Mr. Jimmy. Have you been looking into it?" "Looking into it? I have been all through this here first part, and by election time I allow I'll be ready for examination." "Indeed?" "Yes, sir, but it is such a pretty thing. Only to think of ciphering by letters. Why, sir, the sums come out and bring the answers exactly like figures. Just stop a minute. Look here. A stands for 6, and B stands for 8, and C stands for 4, and D stands for figure 10. Now if I say A plus B minus C equals D, it is all the same as if I said 6 is 6, and 8 makes 14, and 4 subtracted leaves 10. Why, sir, I done a whole slate full of letters and signs, and afterwards, when I tried by figures, then every one of them came out right and brung the answer. I mean to cipher by letters altogether." "Mr. Jimmy, my company is nearly out of sight. If you can get along this way through simple and quadratic equations by our meeting, your chance will not be so bad. Good morning, sir." But our man of letters quit ciphering the new way and returned to plain figures long before reaching equations, and so he could not become our professor. Yet anxious to do us all the good in his power after our college opened, he waited on me, a leading trustee, with a proposal to board our students, and authorized me to publish as how Mr. James Jimmy will take strange students not belonging to Woodville, to board at $1 a week, and find everything, washing included, and will black their shoes 3 times a week to boot, and give them their dogwood and cherry bitters every morning into the bargain. The most extraordinary candidate, however, was Mr. Solomon Rapid. He was now somewhat advanced into the shaving age, and was ready to assume offices the most opposite in character, although justice compels us to say Mr. Rapid was as fit for one thing as another. Deeming it waste of time to prepare for any station till he was certain of obtaining it, he wisely demanded the place first, and then set to work to become qualified for its duties, being, I suspect, the very man, or some relation of his, who is recorded as not knowing whether he could read Greek, as he had never tried. And besides, Mr. Solomon Rapid contended that all offices, from president down to fence viewer, were open to every white American citizen, and that every Republican had a blood-bought right to seek any that struck his fancy, and that if the profits were less, or the duties more onerous than had been anticipated, that a man ought to resign and try another. Naturally, therefore, Mr. Rapid thought he would like to sit in our chair of languages, or have some employment in the State College, and hence he called for that purpose on Dr. Sylvan, who, knowing the candidate's character, maliciously sent him to me. Accordingly the young gentleman presented himself, and without ceremony instantly made known his business thus: "I heerd, sir, you wanted somebody to teach the state school, and I'm come to let you know I'm willing to take the place." "Yes, sir, we are going to elect a professor of languages, who is to be the principal and a professor." "Well, I don't care which I take, but I'm willing to be the principal. I can teach cipherin', readin', writin', joggraphy, surveyin', grammar, spellin', definition, parsin'." "Are you a linguist?" "Sir? You, of course, understand the dead languages." "Well, can't say I ever seed much of them, though I have heerd tell of 'em. But I can soon learn 'em. They ain't no more than a few of them, I allow." "Oh, my dear sir, it is not possible. We can't." "Well, I never seed what I couldn't learn about as smart as anybody." "Mr. Rapid, I do not mean to question your abilities, but if you are now wholly unacquainted with the dead languages, it is impossible for you or any other talented man to learn them under 4 or 5 years." "Pshaw, foo! I bet I learn one in 3 weeks. Try me, sir. Let's have the first one first. How many are there?" "Mr. Rapid, it is utterly impossible." but if you insist, I will loan you a Latin book." "That's your sort. Let me have it. That's all I want. Fair play." Accordingly I handed him a copy of History Sacchari, with which he soon went away, saying he "didn't allow it would take long to get through Latin if 'twas only such a thin patch of a book as that." In a few weeks, to my no small surprise, Mr. Solomon Rapid again presented himself, and drawing forth the book, began with a triumphant expression of countenance. "Well, sir, I've done the Latin." "Done the Latin?" "Yes, I can read it as fast as English." "Read it as fast as English?" "Yes, as fast as English, and I didn't find it hard at all." "May I try you on a page?" Try away, that's what I've come for." "Please read here then, Mr. Rapid," and in order to give him a fair chance, I pointed to the first lines of the first chapter, viz. "In principio Deus creavit coelum et terram, intra sex dies, primo die fecit lucum," etc. "That, sir?" And then he read thus: "In principio Deus creavit coelum et terram, intra sex dies, primo die fecit lucum," etc. "That will do, Mr. Rapid." "Aha! I told you so." "Yes, yes, but translate." "Translate?" eyebrows elevating. "Yes, translate. Render it." "Render it? How's that?" Forehead more wrinkled. "Why, yes, render it into English. Give me the meaning of it." "Meaning?" Staring full in my face, his eyes like saucers, and forehead wrinkled with the furrows of 80. "Meaning? I didn't know it had any meaning. I thought it was a dead language." Well, reader, I am glad you are not laughing at Mr. Rapid, for how should anything dead speak out so as to be understood? And indeed, does not his definition suit the vexed feeling of some young gentlemen attempting to read Latin without any interlinear translation, and who, inwardly cursing both book and teacher, blast their souls, if they can make any sense out of it? The ancients may yet speak in their own languages to a few, but to most who boast the honor of their acquaintance, they are certainly dead in the sense of Solomon Rapid. End of selecting the faculty. Recording by Philip Gould. Coffee Break Collection 14. New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson. It little profits that an idle king, by this still hearth among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife, I mete and dole unequal laws unto a savage race, that hoard, and sleep, and feed, and know not me. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. All times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly, both with those that loved me and alone, on shore, and when through scudding drifts the rainy Hyades vexed the dim sea. I am become a name, for always roaming with a hungry heart, much have I seen and known, cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments, myself not least, but honored of them all, and drunk delight of battle with my peers, far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. I am a part of all that I have met, yet all experience is an arch, wherethrough gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. How dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use, as though to breathe were life. Life piled on life were all too little, and of one to me. Little remains, but every hour is saved from that eternal silence something more, a bringer of new things, and vile it were for some 3 suns to store and hoard myself, and this grey spirit yearning in desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought. This is my son, mine own Telemachus, to whom I leave the sceptre and the isle, well loved of me, discerning to fulfill this labour by slow prudence to make mild a rugged people, and through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good. Most blameless is he, centred in the sphere of common duties, decent not to fail in offices of tenderness, and pay meet adoration to my household gods when I am gone. He works his work, I mine. There lies the port. The vessel puffs her sail. There gloom the dark broad seas. My mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine and opposed. Free hearts, free foreheads, you and I are old. Old age hath yet his honour and his toil. Death closes all, but something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. The long day wanes. The slow moon climbs. The deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows. For my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. End of Ulysses, recording by Philip Gould.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Uncle Richard's New Year's Dinner by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Prissy Baker was in Oscar Miller's store New Year's morning buying matches, for New Year's was not kept as a business holiday in Quincy when her uncle, Richard Baker, came in. He did not look at Prissy, nor did she wish him a Happy New Year. She would not have dared. Uncle Richard had not been on speaking terms with her or her father, his only brother, for 8 years. He was a big, ruddy, prosperous-looking man, an uncle to be proud of, Prissy thought wistfully, if only he were like other people's uncles, or, indeed, like what he used to be himself. He was the only uncle Prissy had, and when she had been a little girl they had been great friends. But that was before the quarrel, in which Prissy had had no share, to be sure, although Uncle Richard seemed to include her in his rancour. Richard Baker, so he informed Mr. Miller, was on his way to Navarre with a load of pork. "I didn't intend to go over until the afternoon," he said, "but Joe Hemming sent word yesterday he wouldn't be buying pork after 12 today. So I have to tote my hogs over at once. I don't care about doing business New Year's morning." "Should think New Year's would be pretty much the same as any other day to you," said Mr. Miller, for Richard Baker was a bachelor, with only Mrs. Janeway to keep house for him. "Well, I always like a good dinner on New Year's," said Richard Baker. "It's about the only way I can celebrate. Mrs. Janeway wanted to spend the day with her son's family over at Oriental, so I was laying out to cook my own dinner. I got everything ready in the pantry last night, 'fore I got word about the pork. I won't get back from Navarre before 1 o'clock, so I reckon I'll have to put up with a cold bite." After her Uncle Richard had driven away, Prissy walked thoughtfully home. She had planned to spend a nice lazy holiday with the new book her father had given her at Christmas, and a box of candy. She did not even mean to cook a dinner, for her father had had to go to town that morning to meet a friend and would be gone the whole day. There was nobody else to cook dinner for. Prissy's mother had died when Prissy was a baby. She was her father's housekeeper, and they had jolly good times together. But as she walked home, she could not help thinking about Uncle Richard. He would certainly have cold New Year cheer, enough to chill the whole coming year. She felt sorry for him, picturing him returning from Navarre, cold and hungry, to find a fireless house and an uncooked dinner in the pantry. Suddenly an idea popped into Prissy's head. Dared she? Oh, she never could. But he would never know. There would be plenty of time. She would. Prissy hurried home, put her matches away, took a regretful peep at her unopened book, then locked the door and started up the road to Uncle Richard's house 1/2 mile away. She meant to go and cook Uncle Richard's dinner for him, get it all beautifully ready, then slip away before he came home. He would never suspect her of it. Prissy would not have him suspect for the world. She thought he would be more likely to throw a dinner of her cooking out of doors than to eat it. 8 years before this, when Prissy had been 9 years old, Richard and Irving Baker had quarrelled over the division of a piece of property. The fault had been mainly on Richard's side, and that very fact made him all the more unrelenting and stubborn. He had never spoken to his brother since, and he declared he never would. Prissy and her father felt very badly over it, but Uncle Richard did not seem to feel badly at all. To all appearance, he had completely forgotten that there were such people in the world as his brother Irving and his niece Prissy. Prissy had no trouble in breaking into Uncle Richard's house, for the woodshed door was unfastened. She tripped into the hostile kitchen with rosy cheeks and mischief sparkling in her eyes. This was an adventure. This was fun. She would tell her father all about it when he came home at night, and what a laugh they would have. There was still a good fire in the stove, and in the pantry Prissy found the dinner in its raw state, a fine roast of fresh pork, potatoes, cabbage, turnips, and the ingredients of a raisin pudding, for Richard Baker was fond of raisin puddings, and could make them as well as Mrs. Janeway could, if that was anything to boast of. In a short time the kitchen was full of bubbling and hissing and appetizing odours. Prissy enjoyed herself hugely, and the raisin pudding, which she rather doubtfully mixed up, behaved itself beautifully. Uncle Richard said he'd be home by 1, said Prissy to herself as the clock struck 12, so I'll set the table now, dish up the dinner, and leave it where it will keep warm until he gets here. Then I'll slip away home. I'd like to see his face when he steps in. I suppose he'll think one of the Jenner girls across the street has cooked his dinner. Prissy soon had the table set, and she was just peppering the turnips when a gruff voice behind her said, "Well, well, what does this mean?" Prissy whirled around as if she had been shot, and there stood Uncle Richard in the woodshed door. Poor Prissy! She could not have looked or felt more guilty if Uncle Richard had caught her robbing his desk. She did not drop the turnips, for a wonder, but she was too confused to set them down, so she stood there holding them, her face crimson, her heart thumping, and a horrible choking in her throat. I came to cook your dinner for you, Uncle Richard," she stammered. "I heard you say in the store that Mrs. Janeway had gone home, and that you had nobody to cook your New Year's dinner for you. So I thought I'd come and do it, but I meant to slip away before you came home." Poor Prissy felt that she would never get to the end of her explanation. Would Uncle Richard be angry? Would he order her from the house? "It was very kind of you," said Uncle Richard dryly. "It's a wonder your father let you come." "Father was not home, but I am sure he would not have prevented me if he had been. Father has no hard feelings against you, Uncle Richard." "Humph!" said Uncle Richard. "Well, since you've cooked the dinner, you must stop and help me eat it. It smells good, I must say. Mrs. Janeway always burns pork when she roasts it. Sit down, Prissy. I'm hungry." They sat down. Prissy felt quite giddy and breathless, and could hardly eat for excitement. But Uncle Richard had evidently brought home a good appetite from Navarre, and he did full justice to his New Year's dinner. He talked to Prissy, too, quite kindly and politely, and when the meal was over, he said slowly, "I'm much obliged to you, Prissy, and I don't mind owning to you that I'm sorry for my share in the quarrel, and have wanted for a long time to be friends with your father again, but I was too ashamed and proud to make the first advance. You can tell him so for me if you like, and if he's willing to let bygones be bygones, tell him I'd like him to come up here with you tonight when he gets home and spend the evening with me." "Oh, he will come, I know," cried Prissy joyfully. "He has felt so badly about not being friendly with you, Uncle Richard. I'm as glad as can be." Prissy ran impulsively around the table and kissed Uncle Richard. He looked up at his tall, girlish niece with a smile of pleasure. "You're a good girl, Prissy, and a kind-hearted one, too, or you'd never have come up here to cook a dinner for a crabbed old uncle who deserved to eat cold dinners for his stubbornness. It made me cross today when folks wished me a Happy New Year. It seemed like mockery when I hadn't a soul belonging to me to make it happy. But it has brought me happiness already, and I believe it will be a happy year all the way through." "Indeed it will," laughed Prissy. "I'm so happy now I could sing. I believe it was an inspiration, my idea of coming up here to cook your dinner for you." "You must promise to come and cook my New Year's dinner for me every New Year we live near enough together," said Uncle Richard. And Prissy promised. End of Uncle Richard's New Year Dinner.
Coffee Break Collection 14, New Beginnings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Excerpt from A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I was standing at the Criterion bar when someone tapped me on the shoulder, and turning round I recognized young Stamford, who had been a dresser under me at Bart's. The sight of a friendly face in the great wilderness of London is a pleasant thing indeed to a lonely man. In old days Stamford had never been a particular crony of mine, but now I hailed him with enthusiasm, and he in his turn appeared to be delighted to see me. In the exuberance of my joy I asked him to lunch with me at the Holborn, and we started off together in a hansom. "Whatever have you been doing with yourself, Watson?" he asked, in undisguised wonder, as we rattled through the crowded London streets. "You are as thin as a lath and as brown as a nut." I gave him a short sketch of my adventures, and had hardly concluded it by the time we reached our destination. "Poor devil," he said, commiseratingly, after he had listened to my misfortunes. "What are you up to now?" "Looking for lodgings," I answered, trying to solve the problem as to whether it is possible to get comfortable rooms at a reasonable price. "That's a strange thing," remarked my companion. "You are the second man to-day who has used that expression to me." "And who was the first?" I asked. "A fellow who is working at the chemical laboratory up at the hospital. He was bemoaning himself this morning because he could not get someone to go halves with him in some nice rooms which he had found, and which were too much for his purse." "By Jove!" I cried. "If he really wants someone to share the rooms and the expense, I am the very man for him. I should prefer having a partner to being alone." Young Stamford looked rather strangely at me over his wine-glass. "You don't know Sherlock Holmes yet," he said. "Perhaps you would not care for him as a constant companion." "Why, what is there against him?" "Oh, I didn't say there was anything against him. He is a little queer in his ideas. An enthusiast in some branches of science. As far as I know, he is a decent fellow enough." "A medical student, I suppose?" said I. "No, I have no idea what he intends to go in for. I believe he is well up in anatomy, and he is a first-class chemist. But as far as I know, he has never taken out any systematic medical classes. His studies are very desultory and eccentric, but he has amassed a lot of out-of-the-way knowledge which would astonish his professors." "Did you never ask him what he is going in for?" I asked. "No, he's not a man that it is easy to draw out, though he can be communicative enough when the fancy seizes him." "I should like to meet him," I said. "If I am to lodge with anyone, I should prefer a man of studious and quiet habits. I am not strong enough yet to stand much noise or excitement. I had enough of both in Afghanistan to last me for the remainder of my natural existence. How could I meet this friend of yours?" "He is sure to be at the laboratory," returned my companion. "He either avoids the place for weeks, or else he works there from morning to night. If you like, we shall drive round together after luncheon." "Certainly," I answered, and the conversation drifted away into other channels. As we made our way to the hospital after leaving the Holborn, Stamford gave me a few more particulars about the gentleman whom I proposed to take as a fellow lodger. "You mustn't blame me if you don't get on with him," he said. "I know nothing more of him than I have learned from meeting him occasionally in the laboratory. You proposed this arrangement, so you must not hold me responsible." "If we don't get on, it will be easy to part company," I answered. "It seems to me, Stamford," I added, looking hard at my companion, "that you have some reason for washing your hands of the matter. Is this fellow's temper so formidable, or what is it? Don't be mealy-mouthed about it." "It is not easy to express the inexpressible," he answered with a laugh. "Holmes is a little too scientific for my taste. It approaches to cold-bloodedness. I could imagine his giving a friend a little pinch of the latest vegetable alkaloid, not out of malevolence, you understand, but simply out of a spirit of inquiry, in order to have an accurate idea of the effects. To do him justice, I think that he would take it himself with the same readiness. He appears to have a passion for definite and exact knowledge. Very right, too. Yes, but it may be pushed to excess. When it comes to beating the subjects in the dissecting room with a stick, it is certainly taking rather a bizarre shape." "Beating the subjects?" "Yes, to verify how far bruises may be produced after death. I saw him at it with my own eyes." "And yet you say he is not a medical student?" "No. Heaven knows what the objects of his studies are. But here we are, and you must form your own impressions about him." As he spoke, we turned down a narrow lane and passed through a small side door, which opened into a wing of the great hospital. It was familiar ground to me, and I needed no guiding as we ascended the bleak stone staircase and made our way down the long corridor, with its vista of whitewashed wall and dun-coloured doors. Near the further end a low arched passage branched away from it and led to the chemical laboratory. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps, with their blue flickering flames. There was only one student in the room, who was bending over a distant table, absorbed in his work. At the sound of our steps he glanced round and sprang to his feet with a cry of pleasure. "I've found it! I've found it!" he shouted to my companion, running towards us with a test tube in his hand. "I have found a reagent which is precipitated by hemoglobin, and by nothing else." Had he discovered a new gold mine, greater delight could not have shone upon his features. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Stamford, introducing us. "How are you?" he said cordially, gripping my hand with a strength for which I should hardly have given him credit. "You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive." "How on earth did you know that?" I asked in astonishment. "Never mind," said he, chuckling to himself. "The question now is about hemoglobin. No doubt you see the significance of this discovery of mine." "It is interesting chemically, no doubt," I answered, "but practically?" "Why, man, it is the most practical medico-legal discovery for years. Don't you see that it gives us an infallible test for blood stains? Come over here now." He seized me by the coat sleeve in his eagerness, and drew me over to the table at which he had been working. "Let us have some fresh blood," he said, digging a long bodkin into his finger and drawing off the resulting drop of blood in a chemical pipette. "Now I add this small quantity of blood to a liter of water. You perceive that the resulting mixture has the appearance of pure water. The proportion of blood cannot be more than 1 in a million. I have no doubt, however, that we shall be able to obtain the characteristic reaction." As he spoke he threw into the vessel a few white crystals, and then added some drops of a transparent fluid. In an instant the contents assumed a dull mahogany color, and a brownish dust was precipitated to the bottom of the glass jar. "Ha ha!" he cried, clapping his hands, and looking as delighted as a child with a new toy. "What do you think of that?" "It seems to be a very delicate test," I remarked. "Beautiful, beautiful. The old Guicom test was very clumsy and uncertain. So is the microscopic examination for blood corpuscles. The latter is valueless if the stains are a few hours old. Now this appears to act as well whether the blood is old or new. Had this test been invented, there are hundreds of men now walking the earth who would long ago have paid the penalty of their crimes." "Indeed," I murmured. "Criminal cases are continually hinging upon that one point. A man is suspected of a crime months, perhaps, after it has been committed. His linen or clothes are examined, and brownish stains discovered upon them. Are they blood stains, or mud stains, or rust stains, or fruit stains, or what are they? That is a question which has puzzled many an expert, and why? Because there was no reliable test. Now we have the Sherlock Holmes test, and there will no longer be any difficulty." His eyes fairly glittered as he spoke, and he put his hand over his heart, and bowed as if to some applauding crowd conjured up by his imagination. "You are to be congratulated," I remarked, considerably surprised at his enthusiasm. "There was the case of von Bischoff at Frankfurt last year. He would certainly have been hung had this test been in existence. Then there was Mason of Bradford, and the notorious Müller, and Lefebvre of Montpellier, and Samson of New Orleans. I could name a score of cases in which it would have been decisive." "You seem to be a walking calendar of crime," said Stamford with a laugh. "You might start a paper on those lines. Call it Police News of the Past." "Very interesting reading it might be made, too," remarked Sherlock Holmes, sticking a small piece of plaster over the prick on his finger. "I have to be careful," he continued, turning to me with a smile, "for I dabble with poisons a good deal." He held out his hand as he spoke, and I noticed that it was all mottled over with similar pieces of plaster, and discoloured with strong acids. "We came here on business," said Stamford, sitting down on a high three-legged stool, and pushing another one in my direction with his foot. "My friend here wants to take diggings, and as you were complaining that you could get no one to go halves with you, I thought I had better bring you together." Sherlock Holmes seemed delighted at the idea of sharing his rooms with me. "I have my eye on a suite in Baker Street," he said, "which would suit us down to the ground. You don't mind the smell of strong tobacco, I hope?" "I always smoke ships myself," I answered. "That's good enough. I generally have chemicals about, and occasionally do experiments. Would that annoy you?" "By no means. Let me see, what are my other shortcomings? I get in the dumps at times, and don't open my mouth for days on end. You must not think I am sulky when I do that. Just let me alone, and I'll soon be right. What have you to confess now? It's just as well for two fellows to know the worst of one another before they begin to live together." I laughed at this cross-examination. "I keep a bull pup," I said, "and I object to rows because my nerves are shaken, and I get up at all sorts of ungodly hours, and I am extremely lazy. I have another set of vices when I'm well, but these are the principal ones at present." "Do you include violin playing in your category of rows?" he asked anxiously. "It depends on the player," I answered. "A well-played violin is a treat for the gods. A badly played one—" "Oh, that's all right," he cried with a merry laugh. "I think we may consider the thing as settled. That is, if the rooms are agreeable to you. When shall we see them?" "Call for me here at noon to-morrow, and we'll go together and settle everything," he answered. "All right, noon exactly," said I, shaking his hand. We left him working among his chemicals, and we walked together towards my hotel. "By the way," I asked suddenly, stopping and turning upon Stamford, "how the deuce did he know that I had come from Afghanistan?" My companion smiled an enigmatical smile. "That's just his little peculiarity," he said. "A good many people have wanted to know how he finds things out." "Oh, a mystery, is it?" I cried, rubbing my hands. "This is very piquant. I am much obliged to you for bringing us together. The proper study of mankind is man, you know." "You must study him, then," Stamford said as he bade me good-bye. "You'll find him a knotty problem, though. I'll wager he learns more about you than you about him. Good-bye." "Good-bye," I answered, and strolled on to my hotel, considerably interested in my new acquaintance. Excerpt from A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.